Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. Welcome to our webinar today on operation and maintenance of WASH infrastructure. As you join the webinar, we'd be very grateful if you'd introduce yourselves in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to know your name and find out where you're calling in from. And we'll be also putting up a couple of polls on screen just as we wait for folks to join, and we'd love to hear your responses on those polls too. So the first poll question there on screen: what level of familiarity do you have with O&M of WASH infrastructure? And the second poll: in your opinion, who should be responsible for the O&M of water and WASH infrastructure? So we'd be really interested in your responses on those two poll questions. And as I say, as you join, please introduce yourselves in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, right in the bottom in the middle there. And we'll be getting started in just a second or two. But already some interesting poll results coming in there. The question on the first one, what level of familiarity do you have with O&M of WASH infrastructure? Well, it looks like everybody who's answered so far has at least some familiarity, with 40% of people so far saying, this is a major part of my work and I'm very familiar with it, which is good news for a WASH O&M webinar. So thank you very much for joining. Please introduce yourselves in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, if you wouldn't mind. Welcome to this 7th of our O&M webinars on operation and maintenance of WASH infrastructure. We're really excited about this, and it's great to have you join us. Thank you very much for joining. As I say, please fill in the polls on the screen in front of you. We'd be really interested in your responses to those two poll questions that are appearing there. We'll be ending that poll in just a second or two. And it looks like so far, as we end those polls, the first poll question on what level of familiarity do you have with O&M of WASH infrastructure? Just about 2/3 of people say that they either work on O&M quite often and are familiar with it, or it's a major part of their work and I'm very familiar with it. So welcome, but welcome also to those who don't have O&M as a major part of their work. We're really excited to have you today as well. Welcome, and let's get talking about O&M of WASH infrastructure. The second poll question: in your opinion, who should be responsible for the O&M of water and WASH infrastructure? And the choices there were the community, the government, the private sector, or some combination of those. Well, almost everybody, 94%, are saying that some combination of those different entities should be responsible. But we do have one response saying the community should be responsible. So interesting there, and I know that we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we move along in this webinar. So welcome once again, everybody, and a special welcome to those French speakers who are tuning in today. We will be providing French interpretation in this webinar, and there's an interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Now, I will say we've had one or two issues connecting the French interpreter this morning, and we will resolve that, or try to resolve that, as soon as we can. So if you don't hear that French interpretation just yet, please be aware we are working on that problem. The little globe at the bottom right of your Zoom screen is where you click to choose either English or French language. And you can see at the bottom of the screen, please select the language that you like. And if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send a chat message to Suzanne at ProWash, and we'll do our best to assist you. You can select that in the chat box. So welcome once again. My name is Jude Cobbin, and I'm the Senior Specialist for Water Infrastructure and Governance at ProWash. And for those of you unfamiliar with ProWash, we're an initiative funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, BHA, and led by Save the Children. ProWash aims to provide support to implementing partners in order to strengthen the quality of WASH interventions through capacity strengthening, knowledge sharing, and applied WASH research opportunities. And to learn more about ProWash, you can visit the FSN network on the link that we'll put in the chat box. And As I say, before we begin, please I'd encourage all of you to just introduce yourselves in the chat box, what your name is and where you're calling in from. We get a huge range of people from all over the world, and it's really interesting for us to know who you are and where you're calling in from. Any questions that you have for the speaker in the webinar, please put in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So not in the chat box, in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll answer those. We'll do our best to answer those in the chat at the end of the talk. So, and lastly, any questions that we don't get to by the end of the webinar, don't worry, they'll be included in a question and answer document that we'll share on the FSN network. And don't forget as well, you can upvote questions in the Q&A box that you'd particularly like us to answer. So to begin, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Liz Jordan is a senior practice specialist in water at DAI, a global development company that tackles fundamental social and economic development problems. Liz has experience working in WASH in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with a particular focus on applying research and learning to WASH programs. At DAI, Liz provides technical assistance to the design and backstopping of WASH projects. Prior to joining DAI, Liz was a senior water and sanitation advisor in USAID's Center for Water Security, Sanitation and Hygiene. Liz holds a PhD in civil engineering from the University of Colorado, Boulder. Liz, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to Jude and to ProWash for hosting this series. I know this is far into this series, so people I know who are following these are very invested in the issue, which I think is great. So as Jude mentioned, I'm a senior specialist at DAI, and my topic today will be somewhat broad. I know there have been several of these webinars focusing on a lot of different topics. So this will hopefully aim to bring some of that together, talking about systems approaches for rural water service delivery, so O&M and beyond that. And the focus here is really around how do we create the right enabling environment for sustainable rural water services. So next slide. I think probably many webinars in this series have started with a slide that looks something like this. I think everyone who's listening here probably can recite these stats just as well as I can, that there is a huge challenge on the sustainability of rural water services. We've all been citing this number, around 30 to 40% of hand pumps in sub-Saharan Africa are broken at any given time. Even when we expand that to look at piped systems in rural areas, there are estimates of around 25% non-functionality for those. And one thing that we maybe talk about a little bit less is when these break, the time to repair the systems can take months. And we know that if for months a scheme isn't working, people are going to be seeking alternative sources of water, which will either be unsafe or will require very long walks, and that's not ideal. I think because we've all been talking about this challenge for decades, probably now, there is a real shift in the way the water sector is thinking. There had been previously this idea that it was really about getting the infrastructure right, and that we would then train a community management committee and it would be done. They would be able to handle the O&M and services would be sustained. And we're now, I think, all coming to the conclusion that that doesn't work. You can't just see this as a point in time intervention that you do once and then you can leave. But it's really, we need to be thinking about water as an ongoing service and think about how we're going to make sure we can sustain it. And that really requires taking a systems approach. So next slide. I know people use the term systems approach in a lot of different ways. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. So I'll just broadly talk about what this means to me. There's so many ways of understanding systems. To me, it's really about breaking down different factors and different actors or people that need to be part of the system for an ongoing service, and thinking about how those are all connected. So there's lots of tools out there for thinking about systems. The one showing now is a building block framework from IRC WASH and others. There are a couple different versions of the building blocks, but they all kind of try to look at different facets of the system, including policy, the institutions, the planning, the finance, the water resource management, and how that feeds up into a rural water system. You can click. A whole different way of thinking about systems is to think about the social networks. Think about the people involved and who's communicating with who and who's sharing information, who's making requests for help and who's responding to those requests. So the diagram shown here is a social network analysis from the Sustainable Wash Systems Project, where they have had a large focus on thinking about that group of people and how are they connected. That's a whole nother way of thinking about systems, and it can be equally important. You can click again. And then there's also looking at system dynamic models, looking very explicitly and sometimes mathematically at how one factor affects another. This is again an example from the Sustainable Wash Systems Learning Partnership funded by USAID, which looks at, in this example, how pumps break down and all the different factors that go into that. And this allows for some real modeling of different interventions and how that would change pump functionality. That's another, again, way of looking at systems that can be a little more complex, a little more mathematical, but can get you some really interesting planning around different scenarios for interventions. Next slide. The framework I'm going to use today is another framework of looking at the full system, and it's the one that's used in USAID's Rural Water Technical Brief, and it was adapted from the World Bank's Global Water Practice and their sustainability assessment of rural water service delivery. This is similar in some ways to the building block approach in that it looks at this set of factors that matter for rural water services. It looks at the capacity of all of the institutions that are involved, the financing, how assets are managed. Those are the actual pieces of infrastructure, the water resources management, and then monitoring and regulation. One thing I like about this is, in addition to looking across that set of factors, it also looks at the different levels of actors. So not necessarily the individual people, but the different institutions and what they need to be doing. So it looks at that national level, it looks at the service authority, which is typically a local government level, and then it looks at the service provider itself and looks at those building blocks across those different service levels. So I think this is a nice balance between being a fairly simple framework to understand, but also getting at all of those different factors and the levels. And of course, this whole system for rural water service delivery is embedded in a country context, including how urbanized it is, what the level of economic development is, decentralization. There's a lot that goes into making a system work that's a little bit outside the scope of the rural water sector and what I'm going to talk about today. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to walk through these different service levels and talk a bit about some examples of interventions we've tried, we've seen, and what we've learned about them. So next slide. So at the national level, the national government is responsible for defining the legal, policy, and institutional frameworks. That's going to be where it's set out who is responsible for what, whether there's different institutions for rural versus urban services, whether there's an independent regulator, what the laws are. The national government is also going to be the first step in figuring out funding frameworks and budget allocations. Even where we've seen decentralization, it's still at the national government often where budgets are allocated down to those lower levels of government. And so it is really important to be looking at financing nationally. And the national government is generally where we'll see regulations for service delivery being set. So what sort of water quality standards need to be met? What are the performance metrics we expect to see? What are the implications if regulations aren't met? All of that is going to flow down from the national level. So it's important to have that set up at the start before diving into trying to change the ways policies and institutions work at lower levels. Next slide. Historically, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of national policies officially endorsed that old community management approach that really was unsupported community management, where communities were left on their own to manage schemes. And often it was assumed that in urban areas you would have utility models, maybe the private sector engaged, but in the rural schemes, it would be fine for communities to manage water systems. And that really is changing, I think, partly because of these very well-known statistics about non-functionality and time to repair. Also, in some places, the actual schemes and infrastructure are getting more complex, particularly where very deep boreholes are needed. And so it's becoming increasingly clear that you can't just leave that in the hands of a volunteer community committee without any support from others. So a lot of countries have recently passed new policies or guidelines that create alternative management models that allow for different, more innovative ways of delivering rural water O&M. You know, I'm only highlighting two here, and I don't mean to imply at all that those are the only two, because this is happening really around the world. But in Uganda, the new national framework for O&M of rural water supplies was just passed in 2020. And that really outlines the approach they intend to take around O&M, including delegating O&M services and clustering areas. And then in Kenya, the WASREB, which is the regulator, put out guidelines for provision of water and sanitation services in rural and underserved areas. And that allows for several different models for rural water service delivery, including being absorbed by a nearby utility, or maybe operating under a delegated management scheme from that utility, or running as a community-based organization with support. So, you know, that really opens up the space for testing ideas that might work in rural areas outside of community management. So one example from DAI's experience is in Mozambique. So in Mozambique, private operators are really prevalent. There's thousands of them serving millions of people, often in urban areas, but also in peri-urban and increasingly rural areas. And one of the DAI projects implemented there, the USAID Speed and then USAID Speed Plus, have been working to create more favorable policy and regulatory environments. USAID Speed and Speed Plus are both multi-sectoral governance projects that they both had a focus on water. And you know, in Mozambique, there was an official delegated management framework, which does lay out that national policy enabling services to be delegated to the private sector. So they were actually an earlier policy than the ones in Kenya and Uganda. And that was, you know, a great step that they allowed for private sector involvement in the provision of water services. But actually operationalizing a policy takes a lot more work. I think any of us who have worked on policy in the wash sector know that having the national government put it down on paper is definitely not sufficient. And it really requires transparency and predictability in the legal framework to enable the private sector to engage. There needs to be a licensing regime. It needs to be clear who is licensed to deliver services and that they're under a regulation. And then there needs to be a clear investment strategy and tariffs, so an understanding of how much users are going to pay and how much other investments will cover, a monitoring system so that it's clear how those systems are operating, and then coordination and collaboration platforms. And Speed Plus really supported all of these. You know, they supported the platform for coordination of all of the private water providers in Mozambique. They also worked very closely with both the providers and the government on getting the licensing down so that these private providers who'd been operating for a long time were actually licensed and formally delegated by the government to deliver services. And this resulted in over 500 of the private operators being licensed in Mozambique, which was a huge step forward in this policy regime. The next slide. So I'll step now to the service authority level. The service authority is a really critical piece of this, particularly as services in a lot of countries are being devolved to more local levels. So the service authority is generally responsible for planning, setting bylaws that are in alignment with the national policies, but are more detailed operationalization. They're usually responsible for financing the investments and maybe some of the service delivery, the on-the-ground monitoring, enforcement of regulations, and then often they're responsible for providing direct support, whether that's for bigger repairs or for parts or technical expertise. And then in some cases, although not always, they are the owner of the assets and have that responsibility, although asset ownership can be placed at different levels depending on the system. For rural water services, often it's the local government who's the service authority. So for example, a district or a county, depending on the country structure. And so that becomes a really important level to intervene at. Next slide. So what does it look like when a service authority is working? And as I said, there are a lot of responsibilities at the service authority level. So when we talk about institutional capacity, yes, there need to be policies and strategies and clear roles and responsibilities. But as I said, at the national level, just having these things on paper is never enough. There actually needs to be a full complement of qualified staff and coordination structures. Staffing in particular is a challenge in a lot of the places we've worked. People tend to move around. Certain, especially remote districts, can be really hard to get staff. And often as services are devolved, there are more structures and more responsibilities going to lower levels of government, but there's not always an associated increase in resources or staff to actually implement all of those responsibilities. So that becomes really critical to address. On the financing side, at the service authority level, they should really be thinking about the full life cycle costs of a water service. So not just the capital investment, but the cost of operations and maintenance, the cost of large replacements, capital maintenance, and also the cost of maybe any loans or financing they're taking, which is part of the cost of delivering that services. And they need to match that to sources of funding to figure out how much can realistically be covered by tariffs. And that will vary. There's places where you can get full cost recovery, at least of O&M, and places where that's unlikely to happen. And then think about where public funds play a role. And at the service authority level, we really hope to see considerations for serving the poor and vulnerable. So whether that's cross subsidies or a different tariff structure, there should really be thought into addressing how to serve the people who maybe can't pay a full tariff. There needs to be clear understanding of the assets in the system and who owns them. Ideally, there should be a regularly updated inventory of the assets so that this service authority knows what hardware is where and what condition it's in. And then clear responsibilities for different asset maintenance categories. We often talk about who's responsible for minor maintenance, who's responsible for major maintenance. Sometimes those are vague terms that aren't well defined, and that needs to be clear with the service authority. For water resource management, this is often a national scale responsibility, as water resources don't follow district boundaries or administrative boundaries in most cases. But ideally, the service authority should be engaged with any water resource management institutions and be thinking about bulk water supply for the service providers within their area and how they're going to pay for any abstraction that's needed and how they interface with other water resource needs. And then monitoring and regulation. Often the frameworks for monitoring, what performance metrics are going to be used, what the regulations are, is set at the national level, but then the responsibility for actually collecting that data and using a monitoring system is happening at the service authority level. So that's an important thing for them to do. And often they're responsible for actually enforcing any regulations, making sure that everyone who's providing services is registered and is abiding by those policies. So that's a lot that the service authorities need to do. And as devolution is occurring, there's often a lot of gaps at this level. So next slide. So one example of a DAI implemented project was in Kenya. So in Kenya, responsibility for providing water services has been devolved to the counties under some of those national policies. DAI implemented the USAID Key Wash project, which had a huge focus on the county level and really filling in the gaps there so that they would have the capacity to operate as service authorities. And they worked with not only the government officials in each county, but also private sector actors, civil society organizations, some of the community-based organizations who were delivering services, and brought them together in fora so that they could discuss who needed to be doing what. Under USAID Key Wash, we developed county water acts. So there was a national water bill, but each county had to pass its own policies, as well as strategic plans and the regulations that would follow. Key Wash also supported counties on wash planning and budgeting, including allocation and budget execution, which is a critical one because in Kenya, many of the counties were actually being allocated funds for water that they were unable to execute, which is, hard in the water sector to see money not get used, since we know there's never enough. And they also supported civil society engagement on that budgeting process to make sure that local voices were being heard and priorities. They also institutionalized these county wash forums, which were a venue for coordination and also accountability among all of these different stakeholders. And they supported those, but made sure they were institutionalized within those county policies and plans, and could be run well after the project ended. This resulted in significant progress on regulations. Just of the counties that were being supported, many of them passed water acts, many of them were working towards their plans and regulations at the end of the project. And it also resulted in a 67% increase in funding allocated to the water sector in the counties Key Wash worked in. So that was a huge success in moving the counties forward as service authorities. Next slide. So I'll go down now to the final level, which is the service providers. And I know a lot of the talks in this webinar have probably focused on this level because the service providers in the end are responsible for operations and maintenance, which is the theme here. They can also be responsible for administering the system. Sometimes capital maintenance is under the service provider, sometimes that's under the service authority. And the service providers are the ones who really are going to be engaging with the water users at that ground level. So that's an important function. Next slide. So a term that's being tossed around a lot is professionalized maintenance service providers. And this is seen as a really key goal, moving away from a model where we expect volunteers to do maintenance work to a professional model. And I want to be clear what's meant by this, at least when I talk about it, is that it's a lot more than just training. You can't just take a group of volunteers and train them and say, okay, that's professional now. The idea with professionalized maintenance service providers is there would be clearly defined roles, risks, and responsibilities between whoever owns the assets, whoever's operating the system, whoever's providing maintenance, and the customers, and that those would be actually formalized in contractual arrangements. And then the maintenance provider should be a registered legal entity and have a defined geographic or administrative boundary in which they're responsible for maintenance services. There should be oversight by local government or an independent regulator, and that should be based on performance-based targets and actual measurable indicators. And water tariffs are transparent and should be subject to regulation. If subsidies are needed, which they often are in rural areas, they should be transparent and have oversight. One thing that we've seen in the water sector, and the World Bank had a report about this a year or two ago, is that there are a lot of subsidies in the water sector, and they're often going to the wealthiest, most urbanized populations. because they're hidden in some of the subsidies for capital infrastructure. So it's important that we're being a little more transparent about where subsidies are in the system and making sure that they are going to people of highest need. So there are a lot of ways professionalized maintenance services can be set up. And I know the last webinar in this series was on the Uptime initiative from Duncan, and that's a group of these professionalized maintenance service providers. There are several of them providing services in many different places. And in some cases, the community still operates the water scheme, but there's a designated professional maintenance provider who comes in for preventative maintenance or anytime a breakage is reported. Sometimes the communities are the asset owners, sometimes they're not. Sometimes everything is delegated to an outside entity that's professional, and customers are responsible just for paying bills and agreeing to the contract with the operator / maintenance provider. So this isn't to say there's no role for communities or that the systems can't still be community owned and operated, but we have to think carefully about who should be providing what aspects of the O&M service and make sure that's all formally arranged in contracts. So next slide. Just one example of how to deliver professionalized maintenance services is the UDUMA model. And I know UDUMA is actually a member of Uptime, and so is included in some of the analyses that Duncan shared a couple weeks ago. So UDUMA is a French private company, and they're dedicated to providing drinking water services in sub-Saharan Africa. And UDUMA's model is that they address the entire chain of water service delivery. So that starts at the point of rehabilitation of water points, includes pump maintenance, water quality control, and the responsibility for revenue. So to make that work, UDUMA is entering into formal long-term contracts with the public authorities. Those authorities grant UDUMA exclusive right to operate pumping equipment on the basis of an affirmage or concession contract, which stipulates all of the obligations for the operator and the tariffs. In this model, UDUMA directly collects the revenue from the end users, and they have a pay-as-you-fetch system there. So that's where users actually pay for the volume of water. That could be a charge per 20-liter jerry can, rather than paying a flat fee per month, which is common in other areas. Revenues are generated from those tariffs collected for water, and the water tariff is set in accordance with local authorities and also takes into account the water user opinions about the tariffs to make sure that it is actually affordable for everyone. All the schemes are then serviced by a pump caretaker, and that pump caretaker receives a percentage of the sales. And then a local mechanic is responsible for preventative maintenance of the pumps. So that's maintenance that occurs on a regular schedule, regardless of whether there's a problem, and also for doing repairs, and is paid a percentage of the water revenues. UDUMA maintains a spare parts supply, and they guarantee a 72-hour maximum downtime. So they guarantee that their mechanic will be there and will do the repair within 72 hours of the breakdown being reported. In this case, UDUMA uses a few new technologies, including mobile money and prepaid cards, to collect data about water usage and to efficiently collect the revenues in even pretty isolated areas. So it's actually becoming a viable business where with a long-term contract, UDUMA can recoup their investment in the rehabilitation and make a profit, making them very incentivized to continue providing this service. The cashless payment system is really key to the model because it allows everyone to access services even without a mobile phone, and allows for that efficient collection of revenue. Water quality analyses periodically are also part of UDUMA's service to make sure that people are receiving high quality water. And UDUMA is managing hundreds of water points across Burkina Faso and Mali, showing that this really can be a viable business model where a tariff that's set in conjunction with the community and the local authorities a high quality maintenance service can actually also be profitable for a private enterprise. So everyone is actually benefiting from this system. Next slide. So that sounds like an amazing model, and I know there are others with great service provision models. Other members of the Uptime Consortium like WAVE in Uganda and Fundifix in Kenya have slightly different models, but are succeeding at providing really high rates of functionality. So what are the factors that are needed in the rest of that system to make that work? Well, the first is those clear contracts between local authorities and service providers. And those need to provide sufficient time for service providers to recover costs. You know, it's unlikely that Uduma would be able to make those investments in rehabilitating water points and in setting up spare parts stocks and training pump caretakers and maintenance service providers if they didn't know they had a 15-year period to recoup those investment costs. If they were only able to operate the system for a year or two, it really wouldn't make sense. So there needs to be sufficient time, and there also needs to be clarity on who's responsible for what. In many cases, some of these professionalized maintenance service providers are not responsible for major rehabs or capital reinvestment, and that needs to be laid out upfront in the contract. There also needs to be enough scale to make this work. Whether the service provider is a for-profit enterprise or a social enterprise, they can't be running at a loss forever, or they're going to be requiring some sort of subsidy. But as the service areas get larger, there are economies of scale. There's also social norms that change when everyone in a service area is receiving this same sort of professionalized service and has the same tariffs and the same modality of collecting those, whether that's pay as you fetch or pay per month. So that's important that there is actually that scale that these are reaching. And that's something that the service authorities can do by actually designating service areas for contracts. There also need to be contracts with the local technicians, and those need to include service standards. So in the Uduma case, it's a 72-hour period for repair. I know in the case of WAVE in Uganda, some of the technician payments are based on functionality and repair time. So those are really important ways to incentivize good service. There also needs to be a high quality service that people are willing to pay for. People often don't want to pay just because it's an improved source according to JMP definitions. You know, they may be more willing to pay if it's a pipe service that's closer to their house, if it's more reliable, if they don't have to have long wait times to collect water. So figuring out up front what the features of the service are that people really care about, and making sure you're providing that as you're asking them to start paying tariffs is really key. And then the tariff structure needs to be fair. People need to be clear that the community right down the road is not paying a different amount than they are. And so that's where having that scale and having clear contracts with the service authorities that set those tariffs can be really helpful. Next slide. So just to conclude, bringing it back to this framework, what I talked about were different examples at these different levels. And I mentioned several different programs, but what really needs to happen is addressing all of those together. So if you look at something like the Key Wash program in Kenya, I highlighted the service authority level, but that program also worked with service providers, both urban and rural, on these different factors, and engaged with the national government around the sectoral guidelines. And so it is important to be addressing all of these. Not every project obviously needs to work on everything. That wouldn't be possible, but it's important to be aware of what's happening at these other levels and not go in thinking you can set up a professionalized service provider for O&M without accounting for what the service authorities need to be doing and what kind of contracting arrangements are going to be needed. These are really closely linked to each other, and so it's important to keep that in mind. And that's all I have today, but I'm happy to take questions for the remainder of the time.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much indeed for a really interesting presentation. You know, I must say and I'm sure I'm not alone here, for those of us who've been working in this field for a while, it's really exciting to see the recognition that really rural wash is a systems problem. And, you know, it's not a once-off intervention, as I think you said earlier in your talk. And, you know, the recognition of the complexity of the issue is something that's really exciting. And you know, I'm sure it's not going to be a mystery to anybody here that some of these factors are being raised now and are part of some really innovative projects like the ones that you've raised. So thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. And can I remind anybody who'd like to ask a question for Liz, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Liz, we have a couple of really interesting questions that have come through actually. And the first one from Xander, I'll read this out. Thank you for the comprehensive overview. In conflict-affected countries where service authorities do not exist, i.e. grey areas of who is the local authority and who owns assets, maintains and operates water systems, has there been any studies on what the next best alternative is to mimic a functional enabling environment? So, and this person is saying, I'm thinking around camps and camp-like settings and what options exist for WASH actors to strengthen water supply systems to support an exit strategy. So essentially around where there's not the kind of political economy infrastructure to support the kind of professionalization that the question seems to dig into. So what do we do then? Over to you, Liz.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think most of the places we're seeing these professionalized service providers pop up are not the most fragile environments. And I think that makes sense that those are not the first places you would go when trying to create a viable model that will cover its costs. Although there is the example of Water for Good, which is, I think, another Uptime member operating in CAR, providing a professionalized service on a circuit rider model. They have made agreements with the service authorities there, but it's certainly a much more fragile environment. They aren't able to offer quite the same on-call service that Wave and Fundi Fix and Uduma are, but they are providing a high-quality repair service with that circuit rider model. One of the biggest differences is it is very heavily subsidized. And I think, quite honestly, that's going to be the case in more fragile environments, and particularly when you talk about camp settings, that you may have to account for very different levels of subsidy that would be required. But you can set up some of these providers and start to use performance metrics. And in some of those cases, you may actually find that you can recoup somewhat more tariffs than you would have thought of if you're meeting very practical needs that people have. So I don't think it's impossible to set one of these up. I think what you need to account for is that they probably won't be covering all of their costs, and that you may need to work with different actors. So if you're in a camp setting, you would have to set that up as part of the camp structure rather than just working with host government structures. And so, you know, there would be a different set of actors to engage with, but I don't think there's a reason you couldn't try one of these as long as you were supporting them financially.
Thanks, Liz. That makes perfect sense. You know, the more difficult and remote and fragile the area, obviously that has cost implications and subsidy implications. Of course, it does. Thank you for that. Another question came along here. You're talking about the Uduma project. Did any of the Uduma's communities have a previous O&M system in place before Uduma came along and set up their scheme? Were there losers, in inverted commas, and what impact did Uduma's scheme have on them? And does Uduma service water points they didn't rehabilitate or set up themselves? So just, you know, what was happening before Uduma seems to be the gist of that question.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly. You know, I think these were under community management before. That said, I'm sure there were people providing services for fee under that community management system. There usually are. So I'm not sure about the question about losers, but it's a really good question that, you know, when you come in, being careful not to displace existing systems. And I know with Wave in Uganda, they've found that the service providers they've hired, the local technicians, are actually doing better working under WAVE. They're making more profit under this pay for performance model. And often they're reaching bigger scale than they could have independently. So, I think there are ways to come in and not displace, but actually augment, some of the local technicians and actors who are already providing services. But that is a really, really good point, to be careful of that and not to come in and just set a whole new system on top of what's already there.
Thank you, Liz. And the next two questions I'm going to roll into one here, and both of them relate to the S word, subsidy, which you mentioned earlier. And so the question is on the Uduma project, how is a high quality service provided in advance of users paying tariffs? Did Uduma provide startup funding? And if so, how is this, or was this repaid? And then the same questioner asks about the Uptime initiative, where in that webinar it was indicated that Uptime required substantial subsidy on top of tariffs. And can you perhaps comment on the issue of subsidy and how it might influence long-term sustainability? So as you've indicated, Liz, many of these projects do need an external source of funding and may not be commercially viable. What are the long-term prospects there? Seem to be the gist of those.
Yeah, those are really good questions. And I think we tend to ping pong back and forth in our sector of, yes, we need subsidies, let's fund this with donor money, or no, subsidies are terrible and everything needs to be commercial. And I think there is an appropriate middle ground there. Some of these rural systems should be covering their costs or be profitable given the time, because there's enough density, there's enough willingness and ability to pay. But then there are places where subsidies are going to be needed. And if you look at the US or really any developed country with a water sector, there's lots of subsidies going in. Not every water system is being operated on a full cost recovery basis. And those subsidies are coming from tax revenue, from the government, that there's public funding. This is a public service. So I think that is the long-term vision, is that you get to a point where any subsidies in the system are coming from local tax revenue and are being spread so that the people most in need of them are getting that, and the systems that can be run commercially are being run on that basis. Uduma specifically covers those early costs with a mix of public and private funds. So there's some funds they're able to raise, and they are putting money in at the start. The Uduma model shows that they will be able to make that back and actually provide a positive return on investment over a long enough period. But it does require an upfront, I would call that an investment rather than a subsidy. But that is important to note, that these are not full cost recovery systems right from day one.
Thanks, Liz. And I love the way you talk about investment rather than subsidy. As we all know, in the WASH world, it's hugely less expensive to provide WASH services and infrastructure than it often is to deal with the health and other fallout from not having it. So maybe it's a case of the words that we choose. Thanks for that. Nice question from Will Tillett here. This is a really good summary of the topic. Thank you, Liz. A question to you and participants. There are lots of examples of building block checklists that look broadly at WASH system strength. I wonder if anyone has developed a similar checklist for whether ingredients are in place at different levels for professionalized maintenance services.
So I think the question is about these service provider, service authority levels.
Yes, I think, you mentioned the 3 different service levels and the different roles and responsibilities that each one had. And you explained very well how those function together and what each level had to do. Is there a kind of generic checklist that you know of that details those roles and responsibilities, or makes it easy for somebody to check off whether they are actually being met or not? I think that's the gist of the question.
Yeah, so I don't know about a universal checklist, but that World Bank document, the Sustainability Assessment of Rural Water Services, has actually a lot of the types of assessment questions that could be asked at each of those levels. It may need to be tailored for the particular context, because occasionally, those roles between the three levels can shift, but that is a really good resource. And then the other thing that comes to mind that hasn't been used in a little while is the USAID Sustainability Index tool, the SIT, that AguaConsult developed. And I think that also includes metrics at those different levels across different building blocks. And, I don't think there's ever going to be one universally agreed on set of building blocks across the levels with like one checklist we can use in every country, because they are nuanced, but there's a ton of resources out there that could guide towards developing that.
Thanks, Liz. And I guess it's the tension between having something that's fairly simple and easy to check, but also you need to acknowledge the complexity of every situation and the different complex links in the chain. Thank you for that. And what I'll say is we'll put the links to those two documents on the FSN website for anybody who'd like to click on them to download them. Question from Eric Chitambo. Uduma appears to be providing very good water services in countries they're operating from. How much are they charging per litre in terms of dollars? Is there a possibility of Uduma expanding their operation base to include countries like Zambia? Now, I don't know if you know that specific, Liz, to that specific level, but what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that. I think I could look up the tariff numbers. We can also maybe, Jude, put the link to the Uduma site and their materials on the website for those who are interested in learning more. And I don't work for Uduma, so I can't speak to their desires to expand and which countries they want to expand to.
Thanks, Liz. We'll do that. We'll put the Uduma link on the FSN site, everybody, and they will. There'll be reports there and contact information too. It'll be really interesting to find that out. Liz, we have time for one more question, and that comes from Tiezi. Thank you for the comprehensive presentation. What social accountability approaches are being used to monitor service delivery and to improve services with regards to O&M? I think that's OPM, or I think that means O&M. So on social accountability approaches, I don't know if you have experience of that and any knowledge of that, Liz.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a couple different ways I've seen this done, and I think it is really important, that accountability piece. The WAVE model in Uganda has, they've set up quarterly, they call them PPP, public-private partnership meetings between WAVE and the district government to review the key performance indicators, to discuss, the service quality. And I think that's really important. In that case, it's actually the service provider pushing the service authority to hold themselves accountable, because they feel that's really key to the services. In the Kenya example, there are these WASH forum, which bring together government officials, development partners and NGOs, service providers, civil society organizations, and that's another forum where they can review data all in a group and have that accountability against performance metrics.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks very much. Well, I'm afraid we only have 3 or 4 minutes to go before the end of the webinar. So Liz, let me thank you again. It's been a really fascinating talk, and thank you very much for answering the questions. I must say it's an exciting time to be in WASH. We're talking now about subsidies or investments. We're talking about a role for local government. We're talking about tax bases. We're talking about enabling the private sector. And for somebody who grew up on a diet of the community, should be responsible for everything. This is really exciting. Thank you very much for the talk. And I'd like to remind everybody that we'll be putting a copy of the presentation and a recording on the FSN network, so that anybody who'd like to listen to it again or share it with anybody, please help yourselves. As we close today, we only have a minute or two to go. We're going to be putting another pair of poll questions up on the screen in front of you as a closing poll. And we'd really like to know your opinions on these, so please take a second just to fill that in. And I'd also like to remind you that in a couple of weeks' time, on October 19, we'll be having a panel discussion with all of the speakers from the O&M webinars, including Liz, where we'll be talking about some of the issues that have been raised in the 7 webinars to date, some of these big questions about where the field is going and what implications this might have for funders and for projects and for the work that we do. So please join us for that. The details are on the FSN network, and we'd be really excited to see you there and to hear your questions too. So the polls in front of you, the first one there, in your area, what role does the government play in the operation and maintenance of water and wash infrastructure? And so far we're getting a good 2/3 of people saying they do some O&M of wash infrastructure, and but results still coming in there. The second poll there, which we've had consistently throughout these webinars, did you find the content of this webinar relevant to your work? And more than 2/3 of people said yes, very likely. So Liz, that's kudos to you for a really great talk. Thank you. And so we will close that. If you please just take the last couple of seconds to click on one of those polls if you haven't already done so, and we'll be ending those in just a second or two. I think we are in it. We are ending that now. Thank you. So poll number 1, what role does government play in the operation and maintenance of water and wash infrastructure in your area where you're calling in from? Well, more than half of people say they do some O&M of wash infrastructure. Nearly 20% say they do hardly any wash infrastructure maintenance, O&M wash infrastructure maintenance. About another 20% say they do most of the O&M of wash infrastructure, but only a very small proportion, less than 10%, one of the respondents so far say they do the largest share of O&M of wash infrastructure. So really interesting to see the emergence of a role for government, or rather a recognition, a new recognition of the important role that government has in this systems approach that Liz has outlined for us today. So Liz, thank you very much. Thank you very much to your colleagues at DAI and to USAID as well. It's been a really interesting webinar. Thank you all. And finally, before we go, thank you very much also to Daniel Scher, who's been the French interpreter for us today and done a really sterling job, including with some early headaches with the Zoom link. So thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you all very much. We very much hope to see you at the final event in this series, which, as I said, in a couple of weeks' time, the panel discussion, plenty of opportunity there for some really interesting questions and to hear from all of our speakers so far. So until then, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you from all of us at ProWash. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.